Hello everyone! Welcome. My name is Alyssa. Today I want to share with you the second half of my February wrap-up. I already have my first half up already, of course. We're getting into past the first week of March, so I thought I really should get this up right away. I only have 4 books to talk about. 2 of them were very short and 2 of them were very long. I'm just going to go in the order that I read them. So why don't we just get started? First, I read The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. This, I'm actually really proud of myself for reading this book. It's only, I think it's, I don't know, like 150 pages, but I've had it right here ready to read for so long. It just hasn't appealed to me, but I just sat down and got through it on a Sunday. And you know what? I don't know how I feel about Ernest Hemingway. How do you guys feel about him? Because he's like, I don't know, he's a good example of separating the art from the artist. And I have some mixed feelings on him, but I'm getting ahead of myself. If you don't know what the book is about, The Old Man and the Sea is about, it takes place in Cuba, right? And Santiago is the name of the old man, and he is a fisherman, and one day, he's gone like a long streak, I think like 80 something days without catching any fish, and he goes out to fish one day and he gets like a really big catch, and he is determined to reel in this fish, to not let it go. It ends up drawing him out to sea for like days on end. In many ways I found this book less remarkable than I expected it to be, considering that it I'm pretty sure this won the Nobel Peace Prize, and it is Hemingway's most well-known and arguably his best work. And I certainly enjoyed his prose, but like I said, I think it was not quite as remarkable as I was anticipating. Santiago is clearly a character that is very resilient and like resists being defeated. He wants to conquer this fish, I suppose. But what I think I found most interesting in this book was actually the internal narration that we get from Santiago, the sort of dialogue that he participates in. Well, I suppose it's not dialogue, it's all very one-sided, with his perspective and his thoughts towards this big marlin, this fish that he has on his line, you know, as it's dragging him out to sea. And we just get like a whole bunch of thoughts. I mean, it's this like old man alone in a boat. But he speaks towards the fish in this very like respectful manner, one of sort of like mutual respect. And I think that this noticing this attitude draws into question any like simplistic oversimplifying the dynamic of this book of being like this man trying to conquer the fish, because he clearly like respects it. So I think that draws into question like the authorial intent of how the author intends you to view the juxtaposition of these two forces, like the old man and the fish, and whether or not like the fish represents the sea. And you know, I personally, like, I didn't dive into secondary sources. I don't know how to interpret this book specifically, but I do know from like being familiarized with Hemingway in a classroom setting, that he is an author that resists like easy extraction of his themes. He remains abstract enough to just give the reader a framework to interact with, but you can't really surmise his intentions without bringing your own participation into the text. And I do think that's a really interesting choice as an author, and like it makes it a much more engaging and fulfilling experience as a reader if you're willing to put that work into it. Personally, I find Hemingway to be a bit of a prick as a person, enough so that I don't care to put so much energy into figuring out what he has to say as an author, when I think there are so many other great authors to draw your attention towards. So I mostly read this book for the desire of having it sort of like in my arsenal of the context of the authorial, of the like traditional canon, but I don't have anything really significant to say about it. I think it's probably worth it if you want to read it. If you don't, I wouldn't beat yourself up about it. Now, moving away from the very white male centrist Western canon. I also read Passing by Nella Larsen this month, and I really enjoyed this book. I had high expectations, and it really fulfilled those expectations. This book was published in 1929, and it takes place in the 1920s. It follows two women, mostly taking place in Harlem, Claire and Irene. Both these women were raised in the same community, a black community, and Claire, at some point, she leaves that community and she ends up choosing to pass as white, and she marries a white man who does not know that she is not also completely white, that she's also black. So this tension in the book kind of comes from that dynamic, and these women are reconnecting in adulthood, and Claire is really wanting to connect back to her cultural heritage and to the black community in Harlem, and Irene sees some reasons why this could be problematic. And this book, I think what I enjoyed most about this book and what really struck me was just how readable it was. It was a breeze to read. It was just like, it just like flowed off the tongue. It was really readable. And I think if you are perhaps maybe tentative or like nervous about jumping into classics or modern classics, this book actually might be a really great place to start, because I just found it quite so readable. The author is also very concise and very focused in her objectives. Like, her themes are very clear, and I think this book, I suppose I would describe it as like a well-edited book. I feel like there's not a lot of extra fluff. The author has something to say and she just gets straight to the point, and the like plot and the narrative doesn't wander very much. It's very clear in that manner. And I think that that's something that lends to its readability, is that it's not meandering, and you're not having to like sort of sift through and dissect what's important. The author is very straightforward. And I also was just really thrilled with how interesting the conversation that the author is putting forward was. She's obviously broaching a very complex and charged topic of racism, as well as colorism inside of the black community and at large, and I found that so interesting. I also think that the author, Nella Larsen, who she was herself a mixed race woman and had a lot of family tension because of that. So it speaks a lot to, like, she's certainly drawing on her own experiences. I believe there's some autobiographical, or I don't know if it's autobiographical, but drawing from her life experiences in this book. And I think that's really evident that this is something that she is very well qualified to speak to, I suppose. And also the author, she's just so ahead of her time. This book has certainly re-emerged, like bubbled to the surface of literature right now. I've certainly been seeing it around, and I think that that can be in part attributed to its connection to inspiring books like The Vanishing Half, which was, you know, very popular last summer. But I think it's also because the topics and themes of this book are just really relevant today, and that is a reason why we're seeing this sort of revisited in a more central, like, literary sphere, and I think that's really interesting. This one is definitely worth your time, in my opinion. I really quite enjoyed it. I next read Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, and this book, the author, he's, you know, as well as being an author, he works in film, and he adapted this book to film as well. So you may have seen this film, but I haven't. Cloud Atlas was published in 2004, and this book is an experimental world epic, and I never read this genre before. It was an introduction for me. It is a big book, about 500 pages, and it is very ambitious in its scope. We follow 6 different stories, and they are revealed in a successive chronological order, and then a descending chronological order. In other words, we read the story, the first half of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the full story of 6, and then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If that makes sense. And these stories interrupt each other in a sort of consuming manner, each incorporating the previous story into the next in a very interesting way. The form of this book is particularly noteworthy, as that is already what I've already talked about. And certainly what I found most interesting about the book, it's hard to talk about the plot considering there are like 6 stories within it, but a consistent theme of the book is the idea of cannibalism. And that sounds really jarring, but it is manifest in like the literal sense, but also in a metaphorical sense of exploring the role of capitalism in sort of a broad global and broad historical timeline perspective. The first story begins in the 1700s and they follow a chronological accession to a futuristic and then post-apocalyptic, post-abysmal setting as well. So we span, 2 historical time periods, a contemporary time period, and 2 futuristic time periods. That's only 5. What did I miss? There are 3 historical, 1 contemporary, and 2 futuristic. Anyway, and there is definitely some commentary on global capitalism and globalism in terms of like influence on culture, but cultural cannibalism is another theme in this book, as which I think is manifest in the way that this book has a huge sampling of genres and time periods, as well as like the literary format that the author uses. Like you begin with a journal entry style, then there's an epistolary style, like a sort of traditional narrative structure, and then sort of like a question and answer response. That like one of the stories takes that format. You also span different like settings and cultures. Like it's very like an experimental world epic is the right word for it, because it's just so like broad in its scope. Huge smorgasbord, is that how you say it? Smorgasbord of content and context and form. This huge sampling, I think, is a representation of how the book itself is a product of cultural consumption and then produced into one single epic. And I think that's really, really interesting, especially because the way that these books feed into one another, each story discovers the one before it, which is existing in some sort of peripheral or obscure sense. The character in the book encounters the collection of, or the journal which we read about in the book before. For example, we start with the journal entries of Adam Ewing, who is an American in the 1700s traveling from Australia to San Francisco, and his journal is discovered by a composer in the next story in the World War II era in Austria. So we see how they kind of like these are interlocking story structure involves a consuming of the previous story, and this very obscure journal would have perhaps been lost as a cultural element of our world had it not been like preserved through its consumption into another story, which is then preserved in another way. I found this book super interesting, and I'm like grateful for it as functioning as an introduction to experimental world epics. For me, and I certainly want to explore that more, personally, the like individual narratives were less interesting to me than the overall experimental form and structure of the book, but you know me, I'm a real sucker for experimental form, and I think the way that a story is told is really significant. So I found that really, really interesting. Personally, I think I would recommend this book, so if you haven't heard of it, or if you've only ever watched the movie, I think it's worth it. So the next book that I read, and the last one that I have to share with you today, is The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. And this book was published and won the Booker Prize in 1997. And this book takes place in India, spanning, or it takes place in two different time periods, in 1969 and 1993, and follows fraternal twins, Estha and Rahel, who we follow them as like 7-year-olds when they're young in 1969, and then they're being reunited as adults in 97. Their mother is Amu, and she is a really significant part of this book as well. The narrative is unfolded to us in a non-chronological order, so it's a little bit hard to explain the book in terms of like a series of events because it doesn't really happen chronologically. But we follow this small family, and Amu, she leaves her husband before the twins are even born, because it is an abusive marriage, and we see that she is a non-conforming kind of a character. She is subverting a lot of the expectations of her culture and the time period that she lives in by being a single mother, and in other ways that we see throughout the book as well. One of the real themes of this book is clearly the author's social commentary and criticism of some of the traditional structure and customs of India. In particular, she's certainly dissecting and challenging the caste system. There are characters in this book who are untouchables, and really at the center of this book is a forbidden love story as well. And I think that the author is actually really, really very clever and sophisticated in the way that she breaks open this conversation and is interrogating these ideas, because having this central challenge to these structures of power being a love story is a very it is charged and it's powerful, but it's also a very innocent method through which to challenge these power structures. I'm not making much sense, but what I mean is that her, like, at the heart of a lot of the focus of the author is these are very political ideas. These are very disruptive ideas, and yet she presents it in a way almost like, how could you disagree with this innocent love story not being allowed to exist, and having a society in which this is not allowed, because this is such a beautiful and non-threatening thing, and yet it is so threatening. So personally, I found that to be a really sophisticated tone that the author chose, and I really appreciated that about the book. The author, Roy, is very involved in social justice and human rights activism, and so I think that observing those in her text really speaks to a lot of the author's personal priorities and her ambitions, and personally I did find that to be the most interesting thing in the book. If I'm honest with you, I don't think that I really loved the narrative as a whole. I found the book really hard to get through and not particularly interesting. I think that's just my personal preference. I found it interesting in terms of like historical and cultural information, as well as the, again, observing all of the social commentary of the author, but I didn't tend to find like a really personal compatibility with like the characters or sort of the story that was unfolding. So I have sort of like a lukewarm feeling towards the book, but I think if it appeals to you, or anything that I've described as particular interest to you, then you might enjoy this book as well. And even though I don't think that it's a favorite of mine, I think it is a very critically acclaimed and praiseworthy book in a critical sense. Well, I think that that is it for me today. Those are all the books that I read in February. If you don't mind, I actually have a question for you guys. I wonder, well, I would like to know maybe what videos you enjoy most getting from me. Personally, I like these monthly wrap-ups as a way of just keeping track of what I read, and I really enjoy doing the reviews, though they're really time-consuming, but I don't want that to be an excuse. I really enjoy doing that, but sometimes I feel like I'm really bad at doing sort of the fun stuff on my channel, like tag videos, or, you know, I've never done like a book haul because I don't really do that. Like, I don't buy books that much. But I would just be very interested in hearing what you guys like. Not that I, you know, I'm not going to have you like dictate to me what videos I should make, but I would love to know what you enjoy, so that that's just useful feedback for me. So if you would like to, please drop that down below, or any thoughts that you might have on these videos. I love hearing other people's thoughts rather than just speaking into the void. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in another video very soon. Bye!